Evening and good morning, I suppose, to the Americans. I'm joined again today by Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. Dave, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me back on.
Dave, so topic of today is again, Israel-Palestine or the Israeli-Gaza war. What is happening on the ground? Like, what is your understanding of the situation at the moment?
So it seems like when it comes to, the split between North and South Gaza, right now in the South, it seems like business as usual for the Israelis, just really heavy airstrikes, tank shelling, artillery shelling, there's fighting on the ground. And then in the North, they recently said that the intensive phase in the North was over and they withdrew some troops from there, claiming that they took out Hamas's like leadership and saying that there was still some pockets of resistance, but that it was they could take care of them with kind of more limited operations. But now it's tough to really get a real gauge of exactly what the situation is like. But some reports, I said it looks like Hamas, since they pulled out of some troops out of the north, Hamas has kind of been reclaiming some territory and is firing more rockets into Israel from the north now. So it turns out maybe they didn't really do that well against them in the north there. So I know the Israeli government is coming under pressure from, kind of some of the more extremist factions, which are part of the Netanyahu government now. These really extreme, settler ministers that are in the Netanyahu government that are saying a lot of things that the U.S. They don't want them to say the quiet part out loud about their plans for Gaza, but yeah, apparently it's a point of contention now that there's all these rocket attacks happening again from the north.
Um, is it even possible, according to you, to eliminate Hamas? I mean, it just seems to me that this is an enemy that you can't really win with more weapons.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the case, especially as they're killing so many people. Like, I mean, in so many cases, they just obliterate family homes, and if they're what are the survivors going to do? If they're especially if they're young men, it's like your whole family gets killed. And your home's being invaded. There's Israeli troops on the ground. It's just they're going to have no problem recruiting, whether or not they join Hamas or another one of the Islamic Jihad, which is another group on the ground there, or they just pick up a rifle themselves. I'm sure that there's kind of disorganized fighters as well now. And what's really crazy is that you see the U.S. We've seen this from Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and then General Brown, who's the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is like the top military officer in the U.S. Both of them have said this strategy that Israel is pursuing is just going to help Hamas grow and recruit more. So, and it's just really something to see that from the top U.S. military officials when the U.S. is funding and bankrolling this whole thing and just continues to give them all this unconditional support. And I think we've even seen the White House say this, that, oh, well, Hamas, can't really eliminate them. And their popularity is growing in the West Bank because the people in the West Bank, things have been really bad there for a while, and it's just gotten worse since October 7th. And they see Hamas as the group that's fighting back and the Palestinian Authority as the kind of the Western puppet. So, yeah, I mean, it just seems like in a way, this is what Hamas, wanted was to draw Israel into this and so they could really put a hurting on the Israeli military. But then again, so many Palestinians have been killed and Gaza has just been obliterated. I mean, it's like more than 50% of all the buildings in Gaza have been destroyed or damaged at this point.
Yeah, and this is the challenge you get here because those of us who have said from the beginning that this is going to happen, that you won't defeat Hamas, that you're probably just going to create more war crimes and more resentment against you. I think have been proven correct, right? I think what you and I spoke about when this thing started, it just seems to unfold, and it's like, I mean, I don't know if you have an idea, but why is it that the people in authority can't seem to relearn the obvious lessons all the time?
Well, I think it's obvious that what Israel wants to do, what the Netanyahu government wants to do, is just completely obliterate Gaza and push all the Palestinians out. Like that is their ultimate goal here. So I guess they think they could just completely destroy and level the place, and eventually Egypt or other countries are going to start letting Palestinian refugees in. I think that is kind of their goal. But at the same time, I mean, Hamas has all these tunnels. I know that they're really extensive, and they have a lot of places to hide, and the rubble gives them more places to hide. So and there's also this idea, you see this in the US from people kind of defending Israel. They're like, oh, Israel, if you say they're carpet bombing Gaza or something, they'll say, oh, they're not carpet bombing Gaza. They could if they wanted to. That's why they're not, they argue that they're not committing genocide or trying to do an ethnic cleansing, because they claim that they could be bombing Gaza more than they are. But that's not really true. I mean, Israel has been bombing Gaza just about as much as it can. They don't have heavy bombers or anything. They're using their air force and their helicopters and stuff to basically launch like constant airstrikes. I mean, what else can they do? But yeah, I mean, when it comes to Netanyahu and again the people in his government, I think their ultimate goal is to get them, clear them out. So the idea of defeating Hamas, I guess that's what that means. I think to them is just get them all out of
Well,
Gaza.
I mean, to what extent is defeating Hamas just an excuse to do what they've always wanted to do, which is to eliminate some of the Palestinians?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all an excuse. The whole hostage thing, they don't care about the hostages. They want to do this is something they've wanted to do for a long time. Now, I think that I know some people, because there's been all this evidence that the Israel should have had plenty of warning about this attack that happened on October 7th. I mean, and it's like kind of a mountain of evidence. They had their attack plan for over a year. You had all these Israeli soldiers that their job was surveillance of the Gaza Strip, reporting all this strange activity, them practicing attacks and stuff, and sources in Gaza told Shin Bet that something's coming. Like, there's just so many indications, and I know some people might think, oh, they let it happen, so they can justify what they're doing in Gaza, which I think is possible. But at the same time, it seemed like they were really focused on the West Bank, because that's really the prize for them, is Judea and Samaria, the biblical name for the West Bank. And especially this Netanyahu government, they came in, and their first coalition statement was basically said, we're going to expand settlements in the West Bank, and our ultimate goal is to annex the territory. And I think that, and they launched all these raids in the West Bank, and the violence in the West Bank escalated to a level, and this is before October 7th, that it hasn't seen since like the early 2000s, since the second Intifada. So I do think part of me thinks they were just ignored, like, we don't have to worry about Gaza. We'll just keep them under blockade, whatever. They can't do anything. But then this happened, and they're like, all right, well, let's just, use this to just completely destroy the place.
Yeah, and it's quite tragic. Have you looked into the story that there's oil and gas on the other side of Gaza as well, and that might play a role in this as well?
Oh, that there's gas there?
Yeah.
I've seen that. Yeah, I think that could play a role, but I think it's more so the goal more so for Israel is getting rid of the Palestinians that are there. I think even, but they are talking about establishing settlements and stuff and rebuilding the place for Jewish settlements, and I'm sure that might be part of the thinking, that there is gas reserves and stuff.
And I mean, how would that not be a violation of international law to expand settlements and force populations? Geneva Convention. I mean, I've lost track of all the laws they've broken by now. I mean, it's incredible the the rationale that they have for this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and another thing, we're talking about the West Bank. That's kind of being, if basically what was happening in the West Bank right now was happening, and this big war in Gaza wasn't happening, that would be the big news, and all the headlines would be about the West Bank. I mean, there's settlers basically going into Palestinian homes at night and threatening them and saying, we're going to kill you if you're here tomorrow. And then they drive these people off their homes and burn their houses down. And this has been happening a lot more since October 7th. And this is really kind of like in the West Bank, we're talking, is like a mini Nakba, in 1948, when Israel drove 700,000 Palestinians out of their homes and out of that territory. And it's happening on a smaller scale right now in the West Bank. And in Gaza as well. Again, that seems to be the goal. I think. What do you think? I mean, to me, it seems pretty clear that that is the goal. That
No, I mean, I would, I go to Elon Pape's perspective on this, which is the best, is that when is basically, make it short, whenever Israel gets an opportunity, it will abuse and exploit that opportunity to further kick the Palestinians out of their home, to expand Greater Israel. Okay, and it will only be stopped if there's a political reality to stop it. So it's sort of like they expand and then they wait a bit and then there's a new conflict they provoke. And, it's sort of the continuation of expansion. That's how I see all of this. It's just the continuation of what was the original project, which is ultimately to clean the whole society.
Mhm.
They don't want the Palestinians there, and they ran into the reality that you can't just get rid of people in Gaza or the West Bank. But now they're sort of tweaking around the system, and in this war, whatever happened on October, what's it, 6th or 7th, is irrelevant in my view. It's just sort of this is the latest excuse to do heavy bombardment, to do as
Yeah,
much damage as possible, because we have public opinion in our support, basically.
yeah. I mean, I think that's right. And if you look at the other aspects of this, kind of the risk of regional escalation, I mean, Israel keeps escalating in Lebanon against
Yeah.
Hezbollah. They launched pretty much their heaviest airstrikes there just the other day, and you have these Israeli officials, military officials, saying we're gonna, turn Beirut into Gaza,
So what do they
and
want to provoke Hezbollah into a regional war as well? I
that's what
mean,
it seems like. And there's been reports from like the New York Times and some other outlets saying that there's U.S. officials who are worried that that's what they're trying to provoke this war, and that Netanyahu might see it as kind of key to his political survival because he has support for the war right now. But if you look at polling in Israel, it shows that the majority of Israelis want him to step down
yeah.
after
Well,
the war. So,
this is something that Gareth Porter has mentioned a few times, that
mm,
Netanyahu is very good at provoking conflicts regionally to stay in power. So it's sort of like it's a political tactic. And also from Israel, they have call it what, a grand strategy or political strategy, if you will, that would always want the US to be there on their behalf, to have the
mm,
big stick, basically. And we see him provoking Lebanon or even Iran, which, I mean, I don't know if you saw, there's now conflicts with Pakistan and Iran at the moment.
yeah,
And there's been a lot of accusations against Iran, that I just can't verify. So, for example, because South Africa, our government took Israel to the International Court of Justice, locally in South Africa, there's a part of the South African politics that is very sympathetical to Israel, and they're
mm,
obviously pissed off at the government. And they've now been accusing the South African government of taking money from Iran to do this because it's elections. That's the accusation. Now, how do you prove that?
yeah.
I mean, Iran is sanctioned. I don't know, because the minister was in Iran, or there was some exchange between them. But it's, you know, this is what foreign ministers do all the time. So that's the latest sort of sticky thing, and it's almost like, okay, South Africa is now going to be accused of being an Iranian proxy, which is just absolutely absurd. Um, it's part of this conflict, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's something like the Iran hawks in the U.S. That's their strategy, is to just accuse Iran of everything and
Yeah.
kind of just get that out. And that's just always on people's minds that, oh, Iran is responsible for this. They're responsible for October 7th. They're behind all the attacks on the U.S. and Iraq and Syria and what's happening in Yemen. It's all Iran. So, and that's another thing when it comes to Netanyahu kind of provoking a big war. If a big war, and I mean, the U.S. is basically now directly at war with the Houthis in Yemen. But if a really big war breaks out, say between the U.S. and Iran, like if it gets to that level, there's going to be a lot less attention on Gaza. So I think that might be part of Netanyahu's thinking too. Provoke this big war, and then he'll be free to do what he wants in Gaza without having to hear, because you see the U.S. officials kind of paying lip service to this idea of, oh, don't you got to reduce civilian casualties. You can't occupy Gaza after there has to be a
Mhm.
Palestinian state. And I think if there was just a big war, that stuff would kind of fall by the wayside. And
Yeah,
Netanyahu would
it's
just
you just
be
get
able to
what he
do what he
wants.
wants. Yeah.
What do you make of this court case against Israel now in the International Court of Justice? I mean, I know a lot of people on, especially the left side of the media, said this is huge, this is big, this is going to stop Israel. I've heard those comments. I mean, do you think any of this will amount to much?
I think if the ICJ rules that Israel's committing genocide, which I know like that full ruling probably won't happen for a while, like a few
No.
years, if I understand it. I mean, because you look at the ICJ, the UN, these like UN Security Council resolutions that the US always vetoes, like even though the UN doesn't have the power to enforce those things, even though the ICJ, if it makes a ruling, if it rules that, because what South Africa wants right now, and this could happen soon, is for them to rule that their actions could be genocidal, and then to order a halt to the military operations. I mean, I think that just piles onto the pressure on the US and Israel. So I think it's definitely meaningful. How meaningful, though, I'm not sure. And
Yeah.
if there's not a ruling for a few years, I mean, it could be over in a few years. But yeah, I mean, if they order an end to the military operations, I think this will give the people in the U.S. kind of, because you have a lot of internal dissent within the Biden administration, within the Democratic Party. It'll give them more ammunition, kind of, to pressure Biden. But he just seems complete, like it just doesn't seem like any of this matters to him. He's just going full
Mm.
steam ahead, support Israel no matter what, even though it might kill his reelection chances, which were low to begin with. But yeah, the ICJ thing, it will really, I think if they rule that it's genocide, I think that could have a big impact, kind of just on the perception of the US in the world, and it might mark kind of a new era of just the US not being able to control all these institutions anymore the way that they do.
Well, I've seen a few interesting things happening since South Africa did this. So, first thing to point out is it is South Africa and Namibia that had apartheid. It's not just South Africa; both countries had it, because Namibia was sort of a South African colony at that stage until 1990. They got independence from us, so it was apartheid rules in both countries. And South Africa took it there, but Namibia had a very interesting one where they accused Germany of siding with Israel and siding with genocide. Now, what a lot of people don't know is the Holocaust did not start in Germany; it started in Namibia during the Second Reich. And actually, Joseph Mengele's mentor was there, for example. The Germans killed 40% of the Namibian population because Namibia was a colony. Okay, so Namibia can actually claim to have had a Holocaust against them. And they are accusing Germany of siding with a country committing genocide. So it's sort of like, they can claim to be the Israeli victim. And it's also democracy. So that is something that is coming, from the African countries that I found quite interesting, how that will play out in the politics. What concerns me, however, is I think the US is just going to try and undermine the South African government, and it's got all the leverage to do so. So I don't know if it's going to amount to much.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm actually surprised that they didn't get ahead of this thing more and put more pressure on South Africa before this happened.
Well, I read, our ruling party is the African National Congress, and I read their weekly newspaper, so from time to time, just to figure out what they're saying. And Ramaphosa was initially hesitant to get involved. Okay, our president. But the unions it was actually a grassroots movement within South Africa, particularly the black unions put a lot of pressure on the government. They had no choice but to act.
Mhm.
And this idea from Francis Boyle was being pitched upwards. Okay. So South Africa's government would lose the next election if they did not act on this thing because of the apartheid memory and the similarities with the Palestinians. There's a lot of sympathy for Palestinians in South Africa. So that sort of gives me a bit of hope that the US will not be able to undermine the government for too long.
Yeah.
But 30% of our trade is with the US. Our economy is the size of Maryland, right? So they can just turn off the taps. It won't affect you. It will affect us, for example. We have now seen South Africa being accused of being an Iranian proxy. South Africa also has demagogues who you can probably argue has made insulting statements against white farmers in particular. I'm from the white minority, and that is, you can argue, genocidal intent, but it's the third largest party. And Elon Musk, for example, tweeted about it. So you're seeing all these sticky news, if I can call it that way, against the South African government. Some of it is true, some is not true, right? So that's sort of what's coming our way. And I suspect the US, if this thing actually gets traction, the US is going to try and undermine our government.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. There could be like a big kind of propaganda campaign against South Africa in the West. And that stuff, those kill the Boer chants does not help the
No, it
image.
doesn't.
I mean, it's just, and I don't you could tell me about this because I don't really know much about South Africa, and I know some people say there's like a white genocide going on there, but from what I understand, and you could correct
Mm.
me or fill me in, is that there's a really high murder rate, like homicide rate in South Africa, and farmers um, are kind of being targeted. And but there's not necessarily it's not necessarily a race thing, from my understanding.
Well, it's no, it's a bit more complicated than that. So,
Mhm,
first of all, yes, crime rate is through the roof. We're like the second or the third is highest in the world. Most of it is gang violence, by the
mhm,
way. So, if you take that out of the equation, you can argue that farmers are disproportionately killed. But now, is it because they're isolated, because they're on a farm, they're unprotected? Is it because they're white? The difference, though, between farm murders and the rest of the murders is our government has openly condemned the rest of the murders, but the farm murders, our government has actively denied it taking place. Okay, and there's a historical precedent for that. So South Africa in 1910, there was a 1910 Land Act where the white population got 80-90% of the land. And the government since Nelson Mandela's time has basically been kicking land reform down the road. They just haven't solved this issue. So there's a historical anger among the black population. Those Kill the Boer songs comes from Julius Malema, who's the third largest party, but he was the youth leader among the ANC. They kicked him out, not for singing that, for insulting the Botswana government. Okay,
mhm.
so there's always been a section in South Africa that is racist, if you will, against the white population, and Malema speaks to that. Okay,
Yeah.
but the South African government has tried to tiptoe around the issue because it's always been put in an uncomfortable position. There was, however, farm murders across the border in Zimbabwe. But the guy who wrote the book about this, a man by the name of Aaron Roots, who I happen to know, he himself was reluctant to say this is genocide. He says it isn't, but it's a problem. Okay, so there isn't nothing to it. The way somebody has explained to me is he says sort of like the Catholic schoolboy scandal. Yeah, it is occurring in the country, but does that, and I say this now as an Afrikaner who's, I know people who've been killed. Does that negate what the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians? I don't think for all that the South African government has done, and it's more negligence than policy, I would argue, because our government's incredibly bad at managing stuff. The revolutionary governments, they don't know how to organize shit. And, that doesn't really equate to what Netanyahu is doing. We don't have an army actively killing people. And that is sort of the equivalence that is being brought in the media. And that's not fair to the Palestinians, I would say.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. But yeah, I'm sure we'll see more of that, as this thing goes on. We might start seeing, because there's not really that much media coverage here
Mm.
of what's happening in South Africa, but I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a thing that will happen to it. Let me ask you on the case. So, something interesting I read. I read, Edward Herman's book, The Politics of Genocide, and he was very skeptical of the Srebrenica massacre of Milosevic killing people in Bosnia. And his argument was basically the numbers he had was between 8 to 30,000. So the numbers got rounded down as it came down. When Madeleine Albright bombed Serbia, it was 250,000. And when the actual numbers came in, it was like 8 to 30,000.
Mhm. I
And
thought it was even lower than that. I thought it was
even
like,
lower than that, right? So
yeah,
Chomsky and Herman said, but this obviously can't be a genocide. It's just these numbers just don't justify it. And then the Croats were also committing atrocities, and that was never part of the equation. And it's all these things. Um, and now, what is interesting is South Africa is trying to use this as the reference case for Israel. So if you go on the basis of the numbers being killed, would you still call this a genocide? And like, I mean, or you like how would you assess it? With that in mind.
yeah. I'm always really careful to use that term genocide because I think it's thrown around like way too much.
Yeah.
Both by governments, like the U.S. has accused China of a genocide in against the Uyghurs, which is just complete nonsense. And then Biden had at one point he accused Putin of committing genocide in Ukraine, and there's no argument that that war is a genocide. Um, and so yeah, if you look at the scale of this thing, I mean, now in 3 months, over 24,000. That's a lot of people being killed. And if you look at the definition from the Genocide Convention, it's basically, I forget the exact wording, but it's like if you're trying to destroy a people or a nation or kind of, part of a nation or something. And I think it's pretty clear that they want the Palestinians in Gaza out of there. And or they want to destroy them, kill them, make it as horrific living conditions as possible. Um, and cutting off the food and the rhetoric that you see
Mm.
from the Israeli officials, they've been trying to clean it up, and I think this shows that they are a little scared
Scared.
by this because Netanyahu, like, I think it was the night before the court case, he said, "Let me be clear, we don't want to expel the Palestinians. We
Mm.
whatever." And that's not been clear at all. There's been leaked documents that show that the government wants their ultimate goal is to kick all the Palestinians out, the 2.3 million that live there, into Egypt. But their big problem is that Egypt is not opening the border. They're not going to let
Yeah.
that happen. So it does seem like their strategy is to kill and starve as many as they can. I mean, so I would say that it
It's
does
pretty.
qualify as a genocide.
Well, it's
And
definitely a war crime. Like, it's just what is the severity of the crime? What threshold?
yeah,
And if you compare genocides to each other, I'm not. If you have like a list of 10 things, I don't think they all have all of them in common, right? So this is the problem you have with these type of things. But I would say it is something that sticks. The South African government, for what it's worth, made no indication that they were going to do this. They did it at like the last moment, and
yeah,
it's
that's true actually.
and sort of in secret. And one reason is our elections in March. So I think they didn't want the US to undermine the next election. So I would say it's clever planning on our government to do this. But the South African government is sometimes they also suffer from illusions of grandeur, like many governments in the world. They think they're too big for their shoes. And our leaders will go in the world and speak on behalf of Africa without realizing our economy is the size of Maryland. So you just have to take that into account, that they're too big for their own shoes sometimes. And I do predict that the US is going to clamp down on us. Like, they're just going to come with some kind of tactic to try and undermine whatever's happened there. They will not forget about this.
Yeah, I would definitely say that that's probably right. Considering how mad the US got about that whole Russian ship thing. I mean, they're definitely I'm sure that they're conspiring something with South Africa right now. And it's interesting to see how the US officials kind of respond when they're asked about this, because if it is determined that Israel's committing a genocide, then they're the accomplices. They're the enablers and the backers of this thing. And that's
What
how
does
history.
US law say about this? I mean, is is US subscribed to the ICJ? I think it does, right? It's signed the
I
Genocide Convention. So
Yeah,
how would that work? Would theoretically a US lawyer would be able to charge Biden or Blinken or these guys with being guilty for this in part?
I guess that could be possible. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that that would happen just because of the dynamics in the US and the politics and stuff. But I think they're definitely scared. They're definitely worried about this, which is good. I mean, so that's, the positive that I think is coming of this is that it is scaring them. You could see it that it is. So it might make them rethink some things. Although, again, with Netanyahu, I mean, he's just full bore, and Biden's not going to do anything to rein him in. But yeah, I mean, if history's not going to be kind to the U.S. during this period. I read something the other day. I forget the guy's name, but he's written books on famine. He's kind of an
Yeah.
expert on famine and hunger. And he was basically saying, like, if there was a ceasefire today, if they just stopped today, there would still probably be at least 10,000 excess mortalities due to starvation and disease caused by this siege. So if this thing keeps going the way it is, I mean, there's some estimates that say hundreds of thousands could die of starvation or disease this year. You never know with these estimates because people always find ways to make do,
Mm.
take desperate measures to survive. If they're not getting regular food, there's other things they could eat, bugs and stuff. I know in Yemen, like, they resorted to eating locusts, and that, like, saved a lot of people's lives.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, if Netanyahu said the other day, this is going to go into 2025, it's going to last all year. So I think it is certainly possible that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians could be killed this year. And I mean, those numbers in such a small place like Gaza, I mean,
That's definitely genocidal. I mean,
Yeah.
in proportion, I've already seen it is 3% of the population of Palestine has been killed, of
Yeah.
Gaza has been killed. So, I think 3% is it 10%? Do you want 15? When do you start calling it genocide?
Mhm.
That's sort of the argument at the moment. So we establish it's bad. I mean, do you think there will ever be a rebuilding of Gaza after this? I mean,
I mean, that's a whole nother thing. Like, yeah, Blinken, when he was in Israel recently, he was saying, "Oh, you have to, when the conditions are right, you have to let the Palestinians who evacuated from North Gaza back in." But North Gaza, I mean, all their homes are destroyed for the most part. It's something like 70 to 80% of the buildings in North Gaza have been destroyed. All the infrastructure is destroyed. They have nothing to go back to right now. So that would be a huge project, and I can't see that happening anytime soon because Israel's not going to want that. They
no.
weren't letting them rebuild as it was before October 7th. That was part of the blockade. That was one of the big problems Palestinians had. A lot of these buildings that were bombed by Israel just remained rubble because they couldn't get the construction materials into Gaza. So I think they ultimately want to rebuild it, as Jewish settlements there.
So you think they're going to try and reestablish the Jewish settlements that Sharon withdrew from? I mean, that's a
I
possibility.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at the strategy document that was leaked back in October from the Israeli intelligence ministry, they basically said the first phase is to evacuate the north and kind of take over the north and then go from there. So I think um and I've seen this, I forget the guy's name, but some member of the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, real extreme, was saying, okay, we got the north, let's conquer the north and let's start building settlements like right away, pretty much. Let's, establish the new facts on the ground there. Um so yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine any American president would be more pro-Israel than Biden is right now. But I think there is a possibility. Well, I mean, it's impossible to predict how things are going to be at the end of the year after the election. But Trump was arguably one of the most pro-Israeli presidents of all time. He let them do whatever they
Yeah.
wanted. Said settlements in the West Bank were legal. So I think there's a chance that if a Republican comes in, they're going to be even more, so just as supportive of Israel as Biden is, but without kind of this pretending to care about the civilians,
Yeah,
without that
I
side.
mean, this is the challenge I see with US politics. There's no restraint. I mean, the Democrats, you think, usually had some restraint, a little bit. Obama had some in him, not much, but he had some. Biden has got nothing. And Trump, I mean, Trump was assassinating generals in Iran. Okay, no, I would remember I was in Iran just afterwards,
Mm.
and the across Iran, all the shopkeepers had like a photo of Qasem Soleimani when he killed them, right? So the entire country was angry. Whatever people tell me of Iran, don't tell me the government's unpopular. I don't believe it. I think the government became more popular thanks to Trump in Iran because it just justified the
Yeah, the
hardcore
sanctions.
Iranians.
Yeah.
It just justified their beliefs, right? And this is the challenge that you have, is that we see no US president that's got leadership to say to Israel, listen, now you're going to negotiate. Now we're going to stop it. We're going to cut off your debt because Israel's a US proxy state. I mean, the US can basically resolve that conflict tomorrow if it just says, okay, we're going to stop giving you weapons until you do what I say. But there is no restraint to that.
Yeah, even so, again, I mentioned it earlier, those reports. There's been a few of them, US officials speaking to the media saying that they're worried Israel is going to provoke a war in Lebanon. In one of them, they said, but we're still going to give them military aid even if they do. It's like,
But why? Like, what is the desire to prop up Israel? I mean, do they need more nuclear weapons? Do they need more weapons? I mean, it's ridiculous.
yeah, I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. If you look at it, this is something John Mearsheimer, I know, has written about. Um, just how, if you look at Israel, I mean, there's just no, like, if you look at global politics, the US doesn't get anything out of this from Israel. Like the argument that they're our only ally in the Middle East, that's something you hear in the US a lot. I mean, that's not true at all.
No,
The US has bases, has a bigger military presence in all the Arab countries, in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Um, so, it's like the US doesn't need Israel and it's just like a liability. But they just keep, it doesn't matter, just no conditions. I mean, just that idea of like giving them weapons and military aid with no conditions. Like you're not going to place any conditions on it. Like, what if they start bombing American troops? Like, will you cut them off then? It's like,
Well, what I struggle to still understand is that across many countries in the world, you can have a debate that says Israel is not innocent. Okay, that's a legitimate statement within South Africa. In South Africa, would be like Israel is guilty, but at least you would say they're not innocent. Even in France, you can say that. In the US, you have to start a conversation with Israel has a right to defend themselves. It's sort of like there's this weird religious like loyalty to Israel. And I looked at some of my American friends, I mean, those on Twitter, they were completely rational on 80-90% of other issues. And then they jump to this issue, and it's just like they fall in line. I mean, I just struggle to explain that cognitive dissonance.
yeah, I mean, I think it's actually changing now. There's definitely more, just because of the media. I think with just the social media era that we're in, and the fact that people can see what's happening in Gaza with their own eyes now, much more so than before. And younger people in their 20s and 30s, whether basically left or right, are much more critical of Israel than older Americans. So I think that is changing. They're kind of losing the propaganda war, but in general, there still is that kind of environment in the U.S. that, with some people, you criticize Israel, it's just immediately you get called an anti-Semite. And I know for myself, like personally, I didn't understand this idea that, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself. All of their neighbors want to destroy them. I didn't even understand until like I was out of college that Israel was, as a modern state, was founded only in 1948. Like, it
Yeah.
hasn't been there that long. In my mind, it was just like, oh, Israel was always there. Like, I was never taught about like the proper history of the country. And I remember just thinking like, yeah, all these crazy Arabs want to kill them. They're all anti-Semitic. It's just like there's no reason for it, that Israel's just there
Mm.
existing and everybody hates them because of that. So a lot of people think that. And then there's all this whole like strain of kind of conservatism in the US, like Ben Shapiro, like the Daily Wire people, who get into the history of Israel but just completely skew it, make it, just a completely false narrative about the founding of Israel.
Well, I've seen, so when this attack broke out, I was in Lyon with friends of mine who are Israeli, or they actually American Jewish. Okay. And again, they're very clued up on many issues. And on that issue, it is sort of like it was almost juvenile in their understanding of their own conflict. And you just like, I don't even know where to start with this stuff. Like, that's just all wrong, or something is wrong. And it's just say it's the Ben Shapiro type of narrative where it's basically Israel's been a victim since its founding, and the evil Arabs want to attack it. And nobody would ask question, okay, who's got the actual weapons? Who's actually doing the killing? Who's actually, anything of these things. You're like, oh, okay, maybe Israel isn't innocent. Oh, maybe Israel is the oppressor. That does not occur to them in the US discourse.
Yeah. And even if, because I've gotten in some arguments with people who have, believe that Israel, oh, they were just moving in, the Zionists, they bought all this property and then the Arabs started the fighting, and, they just wanted their own homeland. That, it wasn't their fault that the war broke out in 1947 and 1948. And it's like, okay, even if that's your narrative, and I know some of them, I could tell from talking to them that they really don't care. Like, they're happy that Israel went in and pushed all the Arabs out. That's ultimately their position. But even if you think that, you look at the 1967 war, which is a whole nother thing, they'll say, oh, it was, a preemptive attack. But from 1967 on, the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was an untenable, a military occupation like that going on for so long. Like, that's an untenable situation. Like, there's always going to be violence in that scenario, always. You can't just say, oh, the Palestinians have to get over it. They act like it's kind of a historical grievance, but it's like, no, they're under occupation now. And then there's the whole like, oh, they gave up all their chances at having a state, but there was never really a real offer on the table. There was negotiations. Negotiations happened in a lot of cases, but they never reached a deal.
No, and okay, you can argue maybe the Palestinian leaders should have just taken a rotten deal at one stage. Maybe.
Mhm.
Okay, fine. But that's still not fair to them. I mean, imagine in South Africa, if the whites made this argument in the 1980s and we said, okay, well, blacks are 2/3 of the country, but they should be happy with the little homelands we gave them, because I mean the government at the time made that argument. South African government at the time said the lands we gave to the blacks are the size of the Netherlands, and theoretically they're underpopulated, and therefore they should be happy with these reserves that are underdeveloped. Well, that didn't fly, and yet we accept that type of reasoning from Israel.
Yeah. And again, and people say, like, I mean, Yasser Arafat, I believe it was like the late 70s, early 80s when he started entertaining the idea of a two-state solution. I mean, that didn't really come into effect until like the Oslo Accords, but he was willing to give up on the territory that they drove all the Palestinians out. They just wanted a free West Bank and Gaza for a long time now. So it's just like, again, it's that military occupation that has just been the cause of all these problems. If Israel didn't take that territory, I mean, there would have been fighting probably for a long time, but I don't think it would be anything as bad as it is now. If they just let the Palestinians, even if the West Bank just stayed part of Jordan, and Gaza was Egypt, I mean, I don't think it would be as bad. There would be as many problems as there are now with the Israeli military occupation.
Sure. No, that's last sort of question on this. In terms of wars and anti-war stuff, is there anything else in the world that is screwed up that we need to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot happening. I mean, the big thing in right now when it comes to the Middle East still is Yemen right now. I mean, the U.S.
Yeah.
has launched 4 rounds of airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen, and over these attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. And if you know anything about the Houthis, they're also known as Ansar Allah. That's their official name. They've faced a very brutal war and bombing campaign that was launched by a U.S.-backed, Saudi UAE coalition from 2015 to 2022. It was really bad, very heavy bombing campaign, fighting on the ground, blockade, lots of starvation in Yemen, disease. A lot of people died. Hundreds of thousands of people died. And in that time, the Houthis only became like a more formidable fighting force. Basically, they developed drone and missile capability. They could hit oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, which is what really made the Saudis kind of sue for peace. So there's been this ceasefire between the Saudis and the Houthis since 2022. It's held relatively well. And now you have Biden bombing the Houthis over these attacks on the Red Sea as if that's going to stop them and not just escalate the situation. I just saw before we started recording that Biden was asked today, are your airstrikes on the Houthis working? And his response was something like, well, working, if you mean by working, stopping them. No, they're not stopping them, but they're going to continue, saying that airstrikes are going to continue. I mean,
Right.
It's just insane. It's
So
crazy.
there's there's not even an evidence-based policy in war. It's just like it's sort of like they're pressing the button. They don't know how to shut off the conflict.
Yeah.
And it's
So,
yeah.
I mean, this could get really bad. And again, it's a real tragedy because it was so bad in Yemen for so long, and the people started getting some relief, and now everything's kind of being reversed. And the Houthis, this is a boon for them. They're trying to show that they're sticking up. They're the only Arabs that are really sticking up for the Palestinians, and able to disrupt so much. This is exactly what they wanted, I think, was to provoke some kind of.
What do you make of the fact that Lebanon hasn't gotten involved in this yet? Hezbollah on them.
Well, I mean, there's been some pretty significant trading of fire across the border, but it still does seem like even after all this, that Hezbollah doesn't want a full war. And this is something, again, going back to those media reports that U.S. officials said, yeah, Hezbollah doesn't want a war, but Israel does. So, I mean, it is only a matter of time before they go too far, before they have to really do something. I mean, I thought the drone strike a few weeks ago, Israel launched a drone strike in Beirut and killed a Hamas official. I mean, that was huge. That was the first time Israel bombed Beirut since 2006. I thought that was going to be it. But even after that, Hezbollah did respond with some missile and rocket fire across the border. That was pretty significant. But still, there's no huge offensive or anything that's happened. But this could happen at any moment, really, I think.
So, with all of these things in mind, it's really the last question. I mean, do you think there's ever a possibility of the US getting out of the Middle East? Because
This is the problem, with these politicians. So over the past few years, there's been kind of this new phenomenon on the right in Congress, kind of the pro-Trump politicians who say, "Oh, we have to end these endless wars in the Middle East," and they say, "Let's get out of Syria, let's get out of Iraq." But they're they're pro-Israel, they're hardcore Zionists, and you can't have one, like, you can't be a Zionist politician and want to support Israel and also want to end U.S. involvement in the Middle East. Like, it doesn't work that
no.
that way. That was the thing with Trump, because Trump came in, saying he wanted to end wars, but he was so pro-Israel. That's why he stayed in Syria. He said twice that he was going to pull out, and one of the reasons why he stayed, he said, we got to protect the oil, secure the oil in Syria, but also he said, Israel asked me to stay because
Well,
Israel wants the U.S. there to push back against Iran.
well,
That's
I mean, the way I saw Trump was, yeah, okay, his actions towards Russia might have been okay for stability, and that's probably a bigger war in a way because there's military nuclear weapons involved. But he was willing to pick fights with China and with Iran. So he's a warmonger and just another version of it.
yeah.
I mean, I saw so many people fall for Trump as this anti-war candidate, and I said, I've seen no evidence of this. It's just he likes a different war, maybe than Biden or Obama liked.
Yeah, and he ramped up all the airstrikes and drone strikes and stuff in the wars that Obama left him. One thing though, Trump supporters always say, "Oh, he didn't start any new wars." That's their line. And he almost did with Iran when he killed Soleimani. I mean, that was really close. But and I used to, you know, always point that out. But now with what Biden's been doing, it's like that actually does kind of sound nice, not starting any new wars. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, when we're talking about Yemen, I mean, there was a war powers resolution passed in Congress to end U.S. involvement in the Saudi war against the Houthis in Yemen, and Trump vetoed that. So yeah, he did everything he could to keep that war going, and it seems to be restarting now with the U.S. directly attacking the Houthis. And what's really amazing, because I followed the war in Yemen very closely for a few years, from like 2018 until 2022 when it winded down. The Saudis, I mean, the fact that right now the Saudis are asking the U.S. to show restraint and not escalate the situation in Yemen, which is incredible. Just because for so long it was the Saudis basically begging the U.S. for more bombs, more weapons, more support in this war against the Houthis, and now they're done with it.
What I know from the oil and gas industry has been that Saudi Arabia is running out of affordable oil, and they cannot afford another war without diversifying the economy.
Mhm.
That war was about to bankrupt the Saudi fiscus, and that's been well known. It's been well known since the 1980s that Saudis lied about their oil reserves. They put more in their books than they thought they had. So
Yeah,
eventually the investors realized it. So the Yemenis were strategically targeting the oil fields, and that can, I mean, it's just bankrupt. It can put the world economy in a tailspin. I mean, this is
yeah,
what's scary about this whole thing.
yeah. I know. Yeah, and the Saudis. I mean, that is the big thing. They really started hitting the oil fields. They got really good at that. So, and they don't want that to start again. Um. So yeah, I mean, it's just like
Okay, well,
such a mess.
okay, this it's really the last question. U.S. elections is coming up Wednesday, September, I think. You guys usually have it split.
November.
November, right? I mean, who is it going to be? Trump and Biden?
That's what it seems like. I mean, Biden is so out of it because for a lot of people are saying, oh, they're going to replace him with Newsom, who's the governor of California.
Right.
They think the
This,
Democrats might pull somebody, but it doesn't seem like they are now. And I mean, it is starting to get close. Like the Republican primaries are already happening. Biden just seems so like old and out of it. But
Trump as well. I mean, they are both what in their 70s, almost 80s. I
yeah,
mean, I mean,
Trump,
isn't
Trump, I think is going to win. I mean,
oh
I think
God.
it's going to be a landslide because they just did the first Republican primary and he was just so far ahead of everybody.
So how is it possible that in a country of 300 million people with quite intelligent people, you can't pick younger candidates and more intelligent candidates than those two? Like, what's happening with that system?
I don't know. I mean, so many people like Americans just don't have any faith in kind of the two-party system at all, really. Um, the Democrats, I mean, they just think they can just do whatever they want and they'll get their candidate to win. And then Trump kind of has this aura, like he represents something to a lot of Americans, kind of anti-establishment. Even though, you know, he when he came in, he hired a bunch of horrible people, and I think he'll probably do that again. I don't think if he has a second term, I don't think he's going to really be any good. Um, but it's hard to imagine him being worse than Biden. You know, with this whole Ukraine mess, and that's all still going on. Biden's trying to fund that for another year,
Oh,
which is just
that hasn't stopped yet? I thought that.
no.
Oh, for fuck's
It
sakes.
seems like it has, but no, it's just been there's still people fighting and dying there, and there's just no shot now. There's no illusion that Ukraine can like push the Russians out, but they want to just keep it going anyway. Um,
Okay.
so I think Trump might be a little better on that, but yeah, I if I'm gonna make a prediction about 2024, I think it's gonna be Trump Biden. I think Trump's gonna win, and you know they might go to some extreme measures to try to keep Trump from the ballot or trying to keep him from the presidency. I could see him picking. Do you know who Nikki Haley is?
Yeah, the she was to the
She,
UN, yeah.
yeah, she was the ambassador to the UN under
Mhm.
Trump, and she's running, and she's a total like about as hawkish as you could be. She's horrific. I could see Trump picking her as his VP to just kind of please the establishment, so they don't try to
Well,
go
what
after
worried
him too
me
much.
about Trump is the when he picked Pompeo as the CIA director, who is involved with this Hudson Institute in Texas. And if you look at, and this is particular to Iran, because I've been following that closely, those guys in that group are fanatically anti-Iran. So
Mhm,
to the extent where there's one guy by the name of Mike Durand that's there, he proposed the balkanization of Iran on separatist lines, on Azuri separatist lines, without understanding a key fact that the supreme leader of Iran is not from the Persian majority, he's Azuri.
mhm.
So you want to separate the society where the minority is actually well integrated into the elite. I mean, it's just a nutcase position. And I was like, I don't understand how these people can be so influential in public policy, but they just happen to, I think it's the military. They come with the military money. They select crazy people to surround the president.
Yeah, Pompeo was really one of the worst people in that
Yeah.
Trump administration when he was the head of the CIA and then the Secretary of State. I didn't think it was possible to have a worse Secretary of State than Pompeo, but Blinken is pretty
Yeah,
pretty
he's
horrific
real
himself
Secretary
in
of
kind of a
State.
different way. But yeah, Pompeo, he was running for president for a little while, but he didn't get like any support. He dropped out pretty early. But I think him and Trump are still in good terms. I don't think he ever really turned on Trump. So it's possible he could get back
Well,
in
well,
and
even
some.
even if he doesn't, I'm sure the class of people that's surrounding him will be selected. This is the problem you find. There's like a
Yeah.
group of people who think on those lines, and it is nuts. It's beyond nuts to think of it. Anyways, Dave, I hope that the US gets some sanity in the future. I know it's
Yeah.
not there yet, and yeah, again, thanks to you and antiwar.com for keeping us sort of informed on these issues. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me back on.
All right, and thanks everyone for listening.